Hey guys, Amoeba Ambusher here, and today we're taking a look at the F-4J, which has a very unique radar that people don't understand and aren't using to its full potential. There's a lot to discuss about it, so let's just get right into the details. Firstly, the radar set that you have has two primary scan modes, non-pulse Doppler and pulse Doppler velocity head-on. Non-pulse Doppler is just your standard search mode with no chaff or ground clutter ejection, so it's not ideal. Pulse Doppler velocity mode does have some chaff and ground clutter ejection, but it's not as powerful or easy to use as a full pulse Doppler radar. This is for two reasons. Firstly, instead of showing how far away the target is, it shows you their closure rate relative to you. Contacts in this upper section have a positive closure rate, and contacts in this lower section have a negative closure. Secondly, PDV radars have a much larger ground clutter band which is not automatically filtered like it is on full PD radars. The width of this ground clutter band depends on multiple factors, but primarily depends on your own aircraft's speed, with the top edge being your aircraft's speed. You can see that as I accelerated off of the aircraft carrier that the top edge of the bar increases as my aircraft's true airspeed also increases. And it's actually a 1-to-1 relationship, as long as you're flying horizontally and the radar is fixed to your bore sight. If your aircraft speed is 1000 kph and you're converging on the enemy at 1000 kph as well, then that means that the enemy is stationary relative to you, so it means they're hovering or notching. So this edge is where notching targets would be if your radar could pick them up. And because PDV head-on radars on your F-4J is less sophisticated than full pulse Doppler radars, it has trouble picking up targets flying away that are slower than you that have positive closure. The ground clutter band also depends on how high above or below the horizon you've angled your radar, but explaining that gets a bit complicated since we'd have to discuss side lobe behavior, so for now I'll just leave it here. Just note that it's easier to lock targets above the horizon in this band since there's less ground clutter. So to summarize, PDV head-on radars show closure rate, with contacts higher up on the display approaching you faster, and it has a hard time picking up targets with closure rate between 0 and your aircraft velocity. Basically any target that's either notching or flying away from you that is slower or at the same speed as you. Your radar HMD also has these two modes with the same limitations, so make sure to keep these limitations in mind when deciding whether to use non-PD mode or pulse Doppler velocity head-on mode. So far, this is probably stuff you already knew, and based on this, it seems the radar is pretty clunky to use when it comes to situational awareness and target prioritization. The biggest issue is that you can't tell how far away somebody is using PDV search mode, so if there are a lot of targets on your display, then it becomes difficult to know which one is closest to you and which one is the biggest threat. It seems the only way to figure out how far away people are is to switch to non-pulse Doppler mode, which has issues with ground clutter, or repeatedly hardlock and then unlock each of your enemy targets to check how far away each one of them are, which is a very tedious process when there's a lot of contacts on your screen. Having information about closure rate is important sometimes, but it's not nearly as important as knowing how far away the enemy is, which is where the PDV head-on radar falls short. However, there is an interesting feature with this radar that I don't think anyone's talked about, that'll actually let you do some degree of range finding, even in pulse Doppler velocity mode. While you're in your regular non-pulse Doppler search mode, you can change the distance scale so that you can only pick up targets within a certain range. These max range settings are set to 9, 19, 46, 93, 185, and 370 kilometers. What's really interesting is that if you set a range in non-pulse Doppler search mode, say at 46 kilometers, then switch to pulse Doppler velocity head-on mode, it'll only let you select targets that are within that 46 kilometer range. Targets that are farther away will still show up on your radar, but you won't be able to cycle through them to hardlock them. You can see here that I'm starting at 9 kilometers non-pulse Doppler mode, then switch into PDV head-on. And because they're more than 9 kilometers away, the cyclic targeting is not letting me select them. But once they're within that 9 kilometer range, then my cyclic targeting is able to select them, now letting me hardlock them. Additionally, while you're in PDV head-on mode, you can use the same keybind to change the distance scale to swap between range settings like you would in non-pulse Doppler mode. You can see here again that I started at non-pulse Doppler mode 9 kilometers, then switched to PDV head-on. And because they're out of range, I'm unable to select them using cyclic targeting. However, if I hit the keybind to change the distance setting twice, then it'll set the maximum distance setting from 9 kilometers to 19 and then 46 kilometers, thus letting me select it. And if we switch back over to non-pulse Doppler search mode, then we can see that the setting has indeed been changed to 46. Because it doesn't actually display what range setting you've set in pulse Doppler velocity head-on mode, you want to either remember what setting you're on at the current moment or swap back to regular search mode to see what range setting you're on, and adjust it depending on what situation you're in. So by using this method, you can actually filter targets based on range. It's just a bit more jank than a normal PD radar. But if you use this distance filtering method, I think that this radar becomes a lot more usable in most situations, since it'll let you automatically filter targets that are too far away for you to care about, depending on the situation. So now that we've covered the radar, I'll quickly go over the rest of this plane's kit. The AIM-7Fs are your primary missiles on this plane. They turn pretty well off the rail and have a very long range thanks to their very long burn time, but also have low acceleration and speed, so they take quite a while to get to their target, and they're also pretty easy to roll dodge if you have the time to prepare. Another thing to note is that Sparrows are very dumb because they have no datalink or inertial guidance, and so will very often go after a target that you aren't locking if the missile detects a stronger radar signal from somewhere else. I know this affects all Sparrows that armed the AIM-7P to some degree, but I feel like it's especially bad with the F-4J, where even on a clean launch, the missile absolutely loves to switch targets or just lose tracking entirely despite holding a hard lock on the target. This happens most often when you launch on a target significantly off boresight, so to give your missile the best chance of not going dumb, try to launch on targets when your nose is pointed close towards them. I don't think it matters where you point your nose after you launch, as long as your target is within your radar gimbal limits, but I do think it helps if you point your nose towards the target for about a second after the launch. That being said, I've also had a fair few instances where I launch on targets flying perfectly straight towards me from directly in front, and the missile goes stupid, so it's still not 100% consistent. And sometimes the opposite happens where you launch at the edge of your gimbal limit and it still tracks. So honestly, I really have absolutely no idea how this works. Because these Sparrows seem so much less consistent relative to the ones on something like an F-18A, it makes me feel like this could potentially be a bug. This seems like a possibility considering that the radar also likes to bug out and tell you that your radar is in PDV mode when it's in regular search, and vice versa. I don't know what causes this, and it does happen occasionally, but it isn't game-breaking and can be easily fixed by switching your radar modes again. One thing that did surprise me is how consistent these missiles are in the rear aspect though. We just talked about how bad PDV head-on is at searching for targets that are running away from you but are slower than you, but once you've gotten that lock, holding it is pretty consistent, and Sparrows are actually quite good at tracking people from behind. Because of how slow the missile is and how well it maneuvers, it's actually pretty fun to watch it maneuver in as the enemy tries to maneuver to dodge it. The missile does technically have unlock-relock capabilities if you regain the lock within 15 seconds of losing it, but while flying without lock it just flies straight instead of maneuvering based on its last known position and velocity like true inertial guidance. In fact, you can get weird situations like this where I launch on this F-4S that's heading towards me, but it instead decides to track this Su-39 that's heading away from me. Then I lose lock on the F-4S, but because the missile just flies straight while going dumb, it actually manages to hit the Su-39. Another issue with trying to use unlock and relock is that if the target isn't directly in front of the missile when you relock, there's a good chance that the missile won't track at all. So it's very inconsistent, but it's still good to know. With the relock, I've gotten a few kills on slow targets that notch my radar very briefly, then recommit early enough that they're still in front of the missile when I relock. And sometimes you can get even stranger situations like this where I launch on this F-4S, then realize that he's notching and switch over to this F-18C, but as I'm watching the missile fly in, it's going nowhere near him, but it looks like it is tracking something until it actually ends up hitting an F-18A on the side. So these missiles really just have a mind of their own and do whatever they want. You just sort of send them out and see what happens. Despite how inconsistent these Sparrows are, I would still advise taking at least 5 of them since the AIM-9Gs are even less consistent, being rear aspect and easily flared. They're only really able to kill unaware targets, but how often are you going to be able to sneak up on somebody in this fat brick of a plane? The HMD is very nice for being able to lock targets off boresight quickly, but you do want to avoid launching your Sparrows as soon as you get a lock, due to the aforementioned issues with the missile losing lock if fired off boresight. Better to wait until your nose is pointing close towards the target if you want to give your missile the best chance of hitting. It's rather unfortunate considering how well the Sparrow turns off the rail. The HMD and the Sparrow would have had a lot of close quarters potential if it were able to track off boresight. The RWR is okay, it shows lock direction and range, but no target ID. Target ID would be nice for being able to know what plane is locking you so you can deduce what missile is fired at you and how to counter it, but it's at least able to detect the MiG-23 radar, and it at least isn't a segmented radar like the Russians. The countermeasures are functional, but they double pop, so if you split them evenly between chaff and flares, you only have 15 total presses, which is not great when you consistently face off against IRCCM missiles in a plane that burns so hot that R60Ms will ignore your flares. Though to be honest, if you find yourself in a close quarters situation like this where an IRCCM missile is fired on you, and you don't have any teammates around to help you, then you're kind of dead either way, but It would have been nicer if this had the F-4E countermeasure set up, where you get 60 regular countermeasures and 30 large caliber countermeasures, meaning you have more total countermeasures and each one of your countermeasure pops is more effective. Either way, you have the best chance of survival if you reduce throttle and maneuver so that your flares are in the IRCCM missile seeker. But if a Magic 2 or an R-73 is fired from behind you, you're just kind of dead. So the best way to counter these missiles is to try and just avoid getting in these situations at all, which unfortunately isn't possible to do in every situation, but you can try. The flight performance is below average for its BR, so don't expect to win any dogfights against dedicated fighters, but it's just functional enough in both speed and turn that it's still usable for most maneuvers as long as you don't get caught in a prolonged dogfight, unlike say something like a Tornado or an F-104. If you have the F-4S, then you'll have a fairly significant edge when it comes to your AOA pull thanks to the F-4S getting leading edge wing slats, a straight upgrade in maneuverability over the F-4J. Otherwise, the planes are basically identical. And the gun is a mixed bag, just like the rest of the plane. Its muzzle velocity is very high and has great ballistics and low drag, basically the same gun as the F-8U and the F-8E, making it very easy to lead compared to something like the Vulcan, which in contrast has a very high drag coefficient. Compared to the F-8s, however, you get one gun instead of 4. The F-4J's gun does have a fire rate 4 times faster than the individual F-8 guns, so effectively you do have the same total fire rate, but it's severely limited by the fact that the F-4J's Gunpod has horrible accuracy and sprays a lot, so even if your lead is good, you do tend to get a lot of hits and crits. Still, I'd say that the gun is definitely worth taking since you do get into a lot of situations where it's useful, like head-ons at multipath altitude or furballs in dogfights where your missiles won't be helpful. So overall, I think this plane actually has quite a lot going for it when compared to other 12.0s, filling the missile bus niche very well while not committing so hard to being a bus that it becomes an unwieldy brick like the Tornado. And I used to like this plane quite a fair bit back when I first reviewed it 2 years ago. However, the current meta has shifted a lot, and in this current meta, I think it's just mediocre at best. This is mostly due to power creep and BR compression, with the most egregious example being the F-18A at just 0.3 BR step above it, while completely outperforming the F-4J in every meaningful way. Additionally, because they've added so many new premiums above 12.0, this plane almost exclusively gets sucked into up tiers facing MiG-21 Bisons, F-18C Earlies, Su-33s, and F-2As, which is an environment that it just cannot survive consistently in. If any of these planes decide to hard focus you, you're basically dead, and even if you survive by running, you don't get anything done and are effectively rendered useless. That doesn't mean that this plane is unplayable, and I do think it is currently one of the more viable 12.0s to play. Just don't expect to carry or even survive every scenario since your defensive capabilities are basically zero, especially in the close range. Now that we know what the plane is capable of, let's talk about strategy and how best to use this plane. The plane works best at range, using the Sparrows and pulse Doppler radar to try and knock enemies out before they can get close to you. There are of course enemies that outclass you massively in this department, like the Su-33 or anything with Fox 3s, but it's still your best option, since if you try to multipath and go head-on into the enemy team, your low speed, maneuverability, and countermeasures will get you killed very quickly, especially once you get spotted, and even more so against something with IRCCM missiles. So you want to try and stay unspotted and kill enemies before they get close to you. Easier said than done. This requires you to first locate the enemy, then fire a missile at them before they spot and fire you. There are two main ways you can achieve this. You can try to rely on your teammates to go up ahead and visually spot targets that you can then launch on from behind without getting spotted yourself, or you can try to rely on your own radar and your own eyes. Previously, I would have recommended you use your friendlies to spot due to how clunky the radar is with the lack of any ranging options, but relying on your teammates also has a lot of issues. You're limited to fighting on your teammates' terms, which will limit how offensive you can be, since you have to try and carefully position yourself so that your teammates are between you and where you expect the enemies to come from. Also, if your teammates have spotted an enemy for you, the enemy is also visible for everybody else on your team, and since you're behind your teammates, it's likely that by the time the missile gets to the enemy, they'll be already dead. And now that we know that we have the option to filter enemies based off of range within the PDV head-on mode, I think it's a lot more viable to use it to spot and prioritize targets. At the start of the match, I like to climb off to the left, maybe up until 5 kilometers altitude. You want to avoid going too high since the higher you go, the harder it is for you to pull into a notch. You want to check the scoreboard to see what BR you're at and what nations you're facing against. If you're in a full up tier, I'd advise extra caution by flying farther to the side since you'll often be facing enemies with better radars and much stronger missiles, potentially R-27 ERs and Fox 3s. You want to be even more careful if you see Iran on the enemy team, since the Fakor is still bugged to not ping your RWR until it's 8 kilometers away from you, meaning you have basically no time to react unless you're already halfway into a notch. At the start of the match, I tend to use PDV head-on mode with the distance set to 46 kilometers. Assuming I haven't had to go defensive myself, once my cyclic target lets me lock targets, I try to select the target that's farthest off to my left and has the highest closure rate, meaning they're approaching me very quickly and they're off on the edge, meaning they're going to be the easiest target to go after, without exposing myself to more enemies. Here, if you're having trouble with your cyclic targeting, then using your mouse cursor to select the enemy you want to target becomes pretty handy. At this point, I do tend to unlock and relock a few of the different targets just to see what position they're in, whether they're high up or down low, and if they're heading towards me or if they're flying off at an angle just to see how good of a target they are. This is information you'd normally be able to see if you had a TWS mode, but since we don't, we're going to have to work with what we have. And as the enemies get closer, you do have the option to fire a missile at long range in this initial BVR joust, and the Sparrows can certainly cover 30 kilometers if the enemy continues heading towards you. But doing so comes with its pros and cons. Firstly, your radar is pretty temperamental even with a hard lock, and has the tendency to just lose lock even on targets that aren't notching. Secondly, there's a good chance the enemy will die to a friendly in a faster plane with better missiles since the AIM-7F is pretty slow. Thirdly, the enemy can just easily notice that you've launched a multipath or notch your missile. As for the upsides, some targets don't have good RWRs with no ranging options or target ID. So if their RWR starts pinging but they feel like they're at a safe distance, then they might just ignore their pings. Plus, if you launch from far away enough, they don't get any visual confirmation that the missile has been fired on them, especially if it's far away enough that the smoke trail runs out. So it can make it difficult to predict when the missile will actually impact, which can occasionally counter multipathers who think that they can get away with multipathing a short bit of terrain but find out that the missile has not reached them yet. Some enemies might also be too busy guiding in their own BVR launches and might overcommit trying to maintain their own hard locks, running into your missile in the process. I personally do tend to use one if no one's launched on me and there's someone at high altitude within 25 kilometers, or there's someone at low altitude who seems like an unaware target or on uneven terrain within 20 kilometers. I tend to prioritize higher altitude targets since they're more of a threat to me. People on the deck are mostly multipathing and busy focusing on people that are directly in front of them, so most likely they're not going after somebody at 5 kilometers altitude like you. Once you've launched your missile at long range, it's mostly out of your control as to whether it hits or not. It's mostly dependent on what the enemy decides to do. If their RWR sucks, or they're unaware, or they're multipathing wrong, then there is a chance that it hits, but sometimes the enemy is aware and notches or multipaths. Sometimes the enemy dies before your missile actually hits. Sometimes your radar loses lock for absolutely no reason, and sometimes you're forced to evade and you lose lock. So it is a bit of a gamble seeing whether your missile hits or not, since it's mostly dependent on factors out of your control. Either way, your goal here is just to survive the initial BVR launch and get into position for the mid-game. And if you can pick up a kill here, then that's just an additional benefit. But saving your missile for a better opportunity is just as valid of a choice. Now for the mid-game, I set my radar distance setting to 19 kilometers, since your priority is to get as many kills as you can, while clearing the area, making sure that nobody sneaks too close to you. At this point, your teammates will have spotted some enemies for you as well, but you don't want to rely solely on them to do all of your spotting, so use both information from your teammates and your own radar to decide which targets to prioritize. Ideally, you want to skirt around the edges of the fight and pick off people one by one to avoid getting overwhelmed, but it can be difficult to do so since with Sparrows and semi-active missiles in general, you have to maintain a lock to guide the missile in, turning these jousts into a game of chicken to see who bails first. Because of this, it's always better to stay unspotted and be the first person to launch in a joust, or better yet launch on targets that are too busy dealing with your friendlies to respond to your missile. And after you've launched, it's a good idea to pull off while keeping your lock at the edge of your radar gimbal limit to delay your merge into the furball. This mid-game is where you want to try and get as many kills as possible, since if the match goes into the late game and you're stuck in a 1v1 or god forbid a 1v-many, you will most often die unless the enemy makes a critical mistake. This plane's only defense is its offense, and otherwise once an enemy gets close in for a dogfight, then you're almost certainly dead. When you do have to go defensive, it's ideal that you try and stick with your teammates, but that's not always possible, so sometimes you just die. And that's the reality of playing this plane. But for 12.0, I would say that it works pretty well. It's not completely abysmal and unplayable, at least if you're not stock grinding with only 2 AIM-9Ds as your weapons. I will, however, strongly suggest that if you're just going through the tech tree and you're trying to decide whether to play this plane over any other American plane, that you should very much just go play the F-18A if possible. It's so much more nimble, its missiles work better, Its radar is so much easier to use, and its lack of speed does not detract from it the fact that it is probably one of, if not the best 12.3 plane that you can play right now. Honestly, even when you compare it with other 12.3s, it's so much better that it probably should be 12.7 because somehow the F-4EJ Kai is at the same BR as it. But if you go to 12.7, there's the F-18C early, which is even better, but it still has to be lower BR than the Su-33 because that's just this plane but better again. And so the issue comes back around to BR compression. Anyways, I've talked way too much about this plane. Well, normally here I would do some post-commentary on full matches. I think this video is long enough, so I'm going to just leave it here. Let me know if you'd like me to do post-commentary on full matches, so I can cover what happens in-game, play-by-play, and get more into the details of the in-game decision-making that you have to make. But that will be all for now. I'll see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.